Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jason Mueller. I am the Director of Systems Engineering here at AttackIQ. And today we're going to talk about uniting threat and risk management within the AttackIQ security optimization platform. But before we do so, let's hang out here for a couple more minutes and see if we have any other attendees that may be running late that are going to join in on this. So stand by and we'll get started here in the next 2 minutes. All right, we are 2 minutes past the hour, so we will go ahead and get started now. Like I said, my name is Jason Mueller, Director of Systems Engineering, supporting the U.S. public sector here at AttackIQ. And again, today we're going to be talking about how you can unite threat and risk management frameworks within AttackIQ security optimization platform to start to understand compliance from a threat-informed defensive perspective. The whole mantra here is that compliance does not equate to security effectiveness. So what we want to get to is to a place where the board level, C-level directors, et cetera, are having the same level conversations at the tier 1, 2, and 3 levels from the operator, the warfighter, the analysts alike. So what we have here, first and foremost, is a lexicon, a framework, NIST 853 controls. It's very mundane, it's pen and paper oriented, and it does take a lot of time, energy, and human capital in order to execute these types of audits. So, that being said, a lot of what comes out of these audits is simply checking of the box to understand whether or not you have a next-gen firewall in place, but it's not validating whether or not that next-gen firewall can in fact prevent and or detect something along the lines of lateral movement, exploitation, etc. So where we're going to take this one step further is now taking this NIST 853 controls, and not all of it in its entirety, because there's only so many controls that you can actually automate and attribute threats to. But today, I believe it's around 40 to 50% of which we can fully automate and execute in a do no harm fashion. Right, so before we actually talk about the AttackIQ platform, let's bounce out and actually see where this kind of originated from. In AttackIQ, we really take this agnostic approach, and a lot of what we are developing within the platform itself is community driven, right? Community driven by way of course, the MITRE ATT&CK framework, but there's a lot more that goes into the attack framework than just simply looking at individual TTPs. Obviously, being able to map these out to nation states, threat actors, or adversarial groups, campaigns, or in this case, being able to take control framework mappings and fuse that into a MITRE ATT&CK lexicon, if you will. So we start to execute these in a production environment, start to gather telemetry, observables within that environment that lends to that empirical data, which we're going to start to utilize to make these data-driven decisions as to where we should associate our time and energy. So that being said, MITRE, Center for Threat Informed Defense, they have a community GitHub repo. And within this repo, you can find many different control mappings, or not just control mappings, sorry, but mappings in general that stem across, like I mentioned, compliance, threat actors, many different use cases. But in this case, obviously, specifically, we're talking to NIST 853 controls. So within this, what you can go to is, first and foremost, is opening up their frameworks directory. And within the frameworks directory, they're going to show you two different versions of the 853 controls, revision 4 and revision 5. Now we can test against either or. Obviously, this is subjective to your organization, but again, simply going into this directory, I'll check. I'll dive into revision 5, and this is where we can start to understand what it is that they put together for the good of the community, right? So not everyone has the AttackIQ security optimization platform as much as we would like them to, but there is still other ways of which you can test against this, right? But that being said, the whole claim to fame here at AttackIQ is being able to operationalize the MITRE ATT&CK framework and build that threat-informed defense by acting as the adversary and starting to play out these real-world attacks in a production environment without doing any harm. Right. So that being the case here, if we want to actually start to look at some of the different layers that's available to us, if we want to download this into a spreadsheet or even pull down the STIX 2.0 JSON data, we can do so as well. I have a couple different tabs up here, so I'll spare you from having to click into any of these. But what we'll do next is showcase what it looks like with regards to the navigation layer or the navigator layers. If you're not familiar with Attack Navigator itself, it's a very powerful open source intelligence tool that's utilized by way of SOC analysts, threat hunters, incident responders, etc., to truly understand what it is from a post-breach perspective that an adversary is capable of doing, depending on that operating system or that cloud environment of which they're operating within. So in this case, with regards to Attack Navigator layers, we can look at it in a few different ways. We can look at it from a NIST 853 revision 4 overview. I know I spoke to revision 5, but I just happen to have revision 4 open in this tab. There's really no difference as far as the construct is concerned. But in this case, we can also go in and look at the actual Navigator layers. Right, so if you're not familiar with Attack Navigator, I would behoove you to really understand the power of this open source technology that you have available at your fingertips so that you can start to do this threat modeling and whatnot. But again, being able to take this and take this compliance mapping that MITRE Ingenuity has provided to the community and be able to translate that into MITRE ATT&CK framework TTPs. Right, now being able to take this JSON file structure by simply downloading this layers, all the layers are associated with the NIST 853 controls of which we're going to test. I can simply click download and I can bring this and ingest this into the AttackIQ platform. So that makes for a good segue as we start to talk about AttackIQ. But before we're doing so, let's go ahead and look at the architecture. And this is more so for on-premise deployment, but in reality, there's really no difference. A lot of you, I'm sure, are familiar with vendors that operate from a SaaS-based approach as well. We actually offer 3 different offerings. We have a SaaS-based where we do hosting, AWS, GCP, Azure. We also have a on-premise OVA, and we also have a air-gapped on-premise OVA. So you can simply take those OVAs from an on-premise perspective and place them within your federated cloud or within your own cloud-based environment. And then from here, we start to talk about mean time to value. How quickly can we deploy, have access to the agents of which we deployed so that we can start to play out adversarial emulation. So you see here on this architecture slide, or the architecture rendering, that from a supportability standpoint, mainly what you see across all enterprise-wide environments of Windows, Mac OS, and Linux. And a lot of the development that's being done today is on the Linux front as we start to speak to ICS, industrial control systems, SCADA, IoT environments, etc. The cool thing though is that yes, we are client server based. We do have an agent. We hate to use the terminology agent. I think it gets kind of lost in translation at times, but it's an agent in the sense of if we look at the attack lifecycle and in its very layman's form, right? You have the exploit, you have the dropper, and then you have the callback phase. And for us here at AttackIQ, we definitely care about the exploitation phase. We're adding many different capabilities onto that front, but it's more so about being able to automate and understand that once they gain access, which they will, because there's no such thing as 100% prevention. So even if you have the best ML AI model that's capable of doing 99.9%, there's still a margin of error there. So, and whether or not that's an adversary or that's an insider, you're still susceptible to some sort of risk, right? So the whole idea of the AttackIQ security optimization platform is not just to validate your controls and the efficacy and whether or not they're producing high fidelity alerts within your environment, but can they do so based on this known framework being that of MITRE ATT&CK, right? And then adding on to that, a risk management framework so that we can start to understand, not just from a compliance standpoint, but a security effectiveness standpoint. So going back to the architecture again, we deploy an agent into user space. We do not shim the kernel. We communicate 443 outbound TLS encrypted back to the platform. The platform itself has RESTful API access. It's fully open. In fact, the scenarios of which we execute against desired targets are in the form of Python. So we have 2,600 plus scenarios within our scenario library, fully customizable, available for you to code against, specific to your own use case. But it is coded within Python, so there's no need to learn multiple different coding languages in order to support some sort of customization. Access to the AttackIQ platform is web UI based, and you'll see that momentarily as I dive into the demo. And then as we break it down here on the left-hand side, we start to get into understanding the security stack, right? So we can actually conduct tests within your environment to understand whether or not there's prevention logic associated by simply running scenarios against your operating system itself without any integrations in place. Now, where the integrations come into play is where we start to understand whether or not there is, in fact, detection logic associated, right? So many organizations, their last line of defense is that EDR, XDR type technology. So in the case of a prevention miss, now let's do some sort of integration, whether it be native integrations, looking at your CrowdStrikes, your Carbon Blacks, your Silences, Palo Altos, et cetera. Or maybe it's more from a workflow perspective and doing integration with your SIEM and digging through, combing, and pulling out specific source types from maybe open source tools like Bro, Suricata, et cetera, that we may not ever have native API integrations with. So if we break it down, again, we have the ability to test against people, processes, and technologies. Right, we spoke to the technologies by way of integrations and operating systems of which we deploy against. People, we can actually test against different personas, right? So I can go and test an environment based on a specific user, based on their credentials, and now I start to understand the visibility and the actionable intelligence that's garnered based on executing those sets of tests as that persona. Now, by default, we operate as system, but again, like I said, we're operating within user space, so we are still operating as if we do not have elevated permissions. And then from a process standpoint, again, so we talked technology, we talked people, and now process. This is where it comes down to understanding workflows, right? It's very simplistic in nature to build out these assessments, run through these assessments, but really where the rubber meets the road is starting to understand if I am starting to do something along the lines of a simple Mimikatz credential harvesting exercise, and I get a prevention and/or detection alert from, let's say, CrowdStrike, that's wonderful, but my SOC analyst may not be monitoring CrowdStrike dashboard. They may be using Splunk, QRadar, ArcSight, et cetera, as their single pane of glass. So if that alert didn't make it to the SIEM, now we have a breakdown in workflow. So we have the ability to understand how long it's taken for these events to actually generate and be passed over to the SIEM for correlation and aggregation purposes. That being said, I'm gonna go ahead and jump into the AttackIQ platform, and I'll run you through what we all came here to hear about is the NIST 853 control mappings. So first and foremost, as far as getting access to the platform itself, username and password, we do have single sign-on integration by way of SAML. So we can integrate with Okta, Duo Mobile, any other type of authentication mechanisms. We also have the ability to do two-factor authentication as well. So if you want to further restrict that based on our RBAC, we have very extensive RBAC controls. We can also associate two-factor authentication on top of that. And again, like I said, incorporate some sort of single sign-on capability here as well. So it is enterprise ready in that sense. With regards to actually deploying the assets, very simplistic. In fact, everything that I do here on the left-hand side, it's very point and click, right? It's very simplistic to build out these environments, push out an asset, and start to run tests. And you'll see here momentarily. So like I said, first and foremost, we're talking assets before we even, now that we've got our tenancy up and running. By the way, we do support multi-tenancy, and I forgot to say that. So from an architecture standpoint, we do support multi-tenancy. So if you have disparate environments, we can deploy multiple tenancies within those environments and still be able to correlate against the data that's being generated. But in this case, like I said, being able to get access to the installers, it's as simple as going to assets and going into the agent installers. And now it's starting to break down What you didn't see on the architecture slide is the supportability at the OS level, whereas here we support Windows 7 all the way up to a Windows Server 2019, 32-bit and 64-bit. The cool thing here is that before we even go to compile and download this, we can do some sort of agent configuration. Right, so whether or not you're verifying SSL certificates, you want to use WebSockets, you want to increase or decrease the heartbeat. And the one culprit I'm sure that many of you have been victim to is either a firewall or a proxy. So if we know that there's a proxy on the host of which we're going to be deploying to, or a suite of hosts that we're going to be deploying to, then let's go ahead and input those parameters here just to save us some time so we don't come across any headaches when we actually do go to compile and download and execute, install these across our environment. Which brings me to another point. The AttackIQ agents themselves, or the assets of which we refer to, meaning that it has the AttackIQ agent deployed on it, we do not require agent-to-agent communications, right? So what we can do is, let's say you have 1,000 endpoints within your environment. We take it from a phased approach. We work with our customers based on a consulting mindset to understand what phase 1, 2, and 3 looks like, what critical infrastructure looks like, what high-value targets, high-value individuals look like, so that we can start to stress test against, as an adversary would, some of our most Sorry, I think I cut out there for a second. So we can start to test against some of our more at-risk endpoints and personnel within our organization. So now once I do the agent configuration and I download the installer itself, we can do a couple things here as well. You can do a manual install. You can install it directly onto the machine of which you download it onto. You can use this from an enterprise deployment standpoint. You can use BigFix, SCCM, or Tanium to deploy this from an enterprise standpoint. Like I said, again, this is silent install, right? So it's unbeknownst to the end user. We're actually running idle 1% CPU, and there's no disruption whatsoever, even as we run through some of these different scenarios alongside the MITRE ATT&CK framework. Now, looking at the assets overview, right? So this is another important thing to point out here is that we have 21 assets installed, but we only have 7 active assets. So this means that right now, snapshot in time, we can only test against 7 assets because that's all that's online. That may sound obvious, but the key thing to point out here too is that when the other 14 assets happen to wake up and come back online, there is no caching that takes place. There's no backlog. They just report back in and say, hey, I'm online, I'm ready for work. So for us, as far as work is concerned, it comes in the form of assessments. And what makes up those assessments is our scenario library. But when we talk about mean time to value, one of the things that we provide to our customers is the template library. Right, so a template is just a grouping of tests, and within those tests is a grouping of scenarios that fall within that specific use case. So within the templates itself, we have a breakdown of a couple different functional areas within cyber, some of which may or may not pertain to you. Obviously, we're here to talk about compliance, but let's talk about a couple other of these templates that we have available to us as well. Right, so operationalized threat analysis. So this is where we're taking and codifying open source intel that's available out in the wild. We're not paying anything extra. Right, the CrowdStrike Global Threat Report, the 2021 reports out and available. We are codifying that as well, and we'll be pushing out a template. But let's also move up to looking at the top 10 most prevalent ransomware in Q1 2021, right? So we all know about DarkSide, we know about the Colonial Pipeline hack. So what is it that this actual template looks like here? If we open this up, construct looks the same regardless of what template you click on. You see a description here. You have the tests that fall within this specific assessment. And within these tests, and I just mentioned DarkSide, so let's see what scenarios fall within there. So now we have 2 scenarios that fall within DarkSide that we can emulate within a production environment. Again, when we talk ransomware and we talk emulation and we talk production environment, I'm sure a lot of people cringe. But the reality is of what we're doing here is simply doing things that are not harmful to the endpoint itself, right? We want to understand, can we bypass signature prevention and/or detection technologies by dumping a file, a ransomware file, to memory, not executing it, but dumping it to memory, right? Or saving it from a static standpoint versus that of dynamic to the file system itself, right? And by doing so, we're hoping to trigger a couple different things depending on your environment, right? One of which is understanding whether or not you have some sort of tools within your suite, like looking at canary files, right? Canary files are a way of identifying ransomware and allowing them to execute without any of your files being executed prior to, so that you can kill that ransomware variant payload off before doing further damage. So you can really get creative here is kind of where I'm going. But more so, after we start to generate any of these assessments, we have reports that are associated. We have tangible evidence that you can now deliver to the boardroom, you can show to stakeholders, or you can use it for mitigation purposes. Outside of that, you see SolarWinds. We do not call it SolarWinds for obvious reasons. In fact, you'll see that's a common theme across the board here at AttackIQ. The red team toolkit theft, which happened to unfortunately happen to FireEye, the SolarWinds breach, and the dark side template as well, or the dark side ransomware colonial pipeline attack. Also, security controls, we have specific use cases. If you want to do security product baseline, you can do so as well. We have attack graphs, which I won't get into, but this is a different way of how we can start to generate high fidelity alerts to validate efficacy from a correlation aggregation standpoint within your security stack to understand whether or not they are aggregating events from a single threaded process based on known attacker behaviors. Right? But again, let's go back to compliance and get back to why we're all here. So we broke this down just based on what I showed you before about how the MITRE Center for Threat Informed Defense, or MITRE Ingenuity, has broken this down within their GitHub repo, right? So again, going back to the layers, we can see all the different mappings here. And what we've done is we've created a template based on these mappings, right? So we can run the entire overview assessment if we so choose, but we can also minimize this to independent control families, right? So if we want to try to test against the IR control family, again, opening this up, you see the same construct, you see the tests that are associated, and within the test, you see the scenario. This is probably a good segue to actually showcase the scenario makeup as well, right? Kind of what this looks like. Within any of these tests, you see this little drop out here. You can jump out to the actual scenario itself, and now it's going to give us a little bit more context as to what to expect with regards to running this specific scenario. So first and foremost, we see the scenario details. We see that this scenario type is an attack. Here's the supported platforms. But the key thing to clue on to really pick up here is the fact that this is available to you. You can download this. This is fully open for you, like I said, when we kick this off, to be fully customizable specific to your environment. So we have obviously 2,600 plus scenarios, but not all those scenarios are going to be modified to suffice to healthcare or Department of Defense or financials, right? So you have that functionality here in the way of wanting to do that via source code. Now, breaking it down from a scenario description standpoint, we're showing you exactly what it is we're doing here and why it's important to you. And then we get into scenario configuration, right? And scenario configuration allows you to obviously configure based upon your environment, but we expose as much as possible within the UI to not inundate the operator or the analyst, but also know that if there's further customization that you want to do beyond this scenario configuration that we provide you within the UI, again, the UI is based upon our RESTful API. So anything you can do in the UI, you can do via API as well. And again, here we have scenario tags as well that we provide out of the box that you can also add your own custom tags here as well. One more thing to point out here before we move on is that any sort of modification that I do to scenarios that are out of the box, meaning that we've provided them, AttackIQ provided, being that we do operate on a 2-week sprint, by the way, so we are pushing out new content every 2 weeks. And given that this is TTP driven and not malicious payload driven, we have the luxury of being able to operate on those sprint cycles. Getting back to the customization of the scenario itself, if I were to go in here and let's say I just fat fingered something, I'm tier 1, I'm a tier 3, I'm a CISO, it's irrelevant. The fact of the matter is I go in here and I try and save this, it's now going to invoke me to save this as a carbon copy. So you cannot do any harm to the original content itself. So those 2,600 plus scenarios that we have, you cannot do any harm. Now you can modify them specific to your liking, but you're going to have to save that as a carbon copy. All right, getting back to the actual assessment itself. So we talked about the different control families of which you can run. Let's actually go and take a look at one of the assessments that I believe I have running currently that I kicked off right before this call. So we have the NIST 800 overview. So NIST 853 revision 4 overview, of which I kicked off here. Let's actually look at one that's already finished up. This one's still running right now. That's why you see 100% with regards to detection. So let's look at one that I ran previously here. If we go to the setup phase, so now we're talking workflows, the simplistic nature of being able to set this up. Like I said, first and foremost, the machine of which we want to test against that has our agent deployed needs to be online at the time of run. So we can simply go in, we can select any one of these machines. And what you see here too is a nice visual representation as to the security technology that resides on that specific endpoint of which we have native API integration with. Right, so in this case, we're testing against a Windows Defender ATP machine. I can cancel out of here. So I've selected my asset target, and now I've got my set of tests, right? So this is identical to what we just looked at with regards to the template itself. Now you have the luxury of being able to modify this by way of dragging and dropping as to how you want to play this out sequentially. And you also have the ability to customize this even further. Now, where we want to get to, and I think everyone would agree, if we're going to start to use the AttackIQ security optimization platform to do NIST 853 control validation or CMMC NIST 800-171 validation, is that these tests themselves should be static. You should not have the ability to modify any of the scenarios that fall within these tests, meaning that when I go in and manage scenarios here, I can manage the configuration of these scenarios, but in order to keep this even across the board, we need to obviously utilize a baseline template. And like I said before, that's being provided by way of MITRE Ingenuity Center for Threat Informed Defense. So in this case, now you have the scenarios that make up this specific test. This test is initial access. We can further go in here and configure this if need be, right? So a lot of flexibility. How much time delay do we want to allow for detection in seconds, right? This is obviously subjective based on the actual scenario of what you're getting ready to execute. If I were to go to this one, this may be different, right? So in this case, I have a bunch of different parameters here that I can modify all the way up to runtime to ensure that when I invoke and I execute this from an adversarial emulation standpoint, that it is in fact taking these configurations of which I provided. Now here, you can make any sort of modification you so choose specific to this assessment without fear, again, of disruption of the scenario library or modification of the scenario library. In fact, any modifications that you do here, it will not invoke you to save a carbon copy because this is specific to the AttackIQ platform itself. Now, again, one more thing, you can drag and drop based on how you want these to sequentially run again. And like I said, maybe not specific to the NIST 853 overview as we start to lock this down, but any other assessment template in here, you can add and remove scenarios as you so choose. So now that we're good to go, we have our target set up of which we want to test against. We have our tests associated. We have our parameters configured. Now we can move into the next phase of this, which is actually running this. So like I said, going in, it's very easy to point and click, right? The most time that you're going to spend with any AttackIQ platform is obviously combing through the results, right? So I'm not going to run this right now, but just to showcase if you did, this is the alert that you would get. And it showcases the fact that we're going to trigger alerts within your security stack, within your security technologies. Again, given that this is based upon a widely documented framework, attacker framework, being that of MITRE ATT&CK itself, when we go and execute these post-breach TTPs within your environment and we do have integrations turned on, if we are not getting alerts, that's exactly the reason why you're utilizing AttackIQ, right? You want to do this sort of stress testing before the adversary is capable of exploiting these weaknesses. And when I say exploiting these weaknesses are more so living out the LAN style attacks, your WMI, your PowerShell, your remote desktop protocol for lateral movements, your writing to the registry for persistence purposes, right? So there may not be even an exploit or a vulnerability associated. These are what we consider gaps and weaknesses. So again, like I said, compliance doesn't equate to effectiveness. So let's get to a point where not only we can be compliant, but also effective in our approach. You can also schedule these. So automation is what we talk and we preach to here at AttackIQ. Automation and doing no harm, right? Mean time to value. And obviously understanding that you can thereby reduce risk in your attack surface, reduce the attack surface, but you can also reduce that mean time to detection as well, right? So in this case, we can start to manage the schedule. I can do this hourly, daily, weekly, monthly, and yearly. And I talk automation before I even, sit in here and watch the results come in. Let me email a report at completion. I may have other things I need to do. By default, every scenario that we have runs with not every scenario, we have a couple from an exfiltration standpoint that run upwards of maybe 15 minutes, but the bulk is running at 2 minutes, right? So every scenario is taking 2 minutes or so to run. If it goes beyond that, or if it attempts to go beyond that, we'll kill it off by default, and this is fully configurable. So where I'm getting at is that you may have 10 scenarios that's going to take upwards of 20 minutes to run. I'm sure you have other things to do. So let's automate this. Let's email a report. Let's select the report type that we want to email. It may be a summary report to send us to stakeholders, or detail or remediation report that we want to send to our engineering team, right? So we can select this, and then we can select any of the recipients. I can select Ben Opal, one of my colleagues here at AttackIQ. And now when I go to save this, barring I set a time, every day at 12 a.m., Ben Opal is going to get a remediation report that's based upon the outcome of this specific assessment, right? So again, the assessment shouldn't change, but the outcomes may change based on what target we're testing against. So in that case, let's actually look at the results here, right? This is the meat and potatoes behind what it is we're doing here. We showcase this in a couple different ways. We can showcase this in an overall combined aspect, right? Which takes prevention and detection. We can look at it from a just prevention standpoint. And this being obviously this is a demo machine. It was not baseline to any specific DoD or private sector guidelines, right? We just simply spun up a Windows machine and ran this assessment against it. But this kind of gives you some context as to where it is we're starting to fail, where we're doing good, and where we need to spend a little bit more time and energy, right? Same with detection, right? Understanding that, yes, we have some integrations in place, so now we can start to understand our detection logic in the event that we are not capable of preventing this style of attack. We also break it down by way of tests, right? So I showcased when we were building this in the setup stage that the assessment's comprised of various tests, and within this test we can showcase the outcomes here as well. We can showcase the scenario which was prevented and or not prevented and or detected, right? So this may be something that's more for C-level stakeholders to visualize, but if we really want to get into, well, how is it that AttackIQ came to the determination that this was in fact prevented and or detected, let's dive a little bit further into the granularity behind these results. Again, you can see the historical run results. So when we spoke to being able to do scheduling here, in the event that I had this running every single day at 12 a.m., you would see drift in the environment if there was any sort of change in the environment, whether there was patch updates that were pushed out, whether there was just GPO configurations that were modified that now leaves you susceptible, not vulnerable to exploitation, but susceptible to gaps and weaknesses, right? And now, like I said, being able to look at it at a per scenario standpoint, looking at the outcomes here. So in this case, we see that we have a file deletion script. We have the date timestamp, the MITRE tactics that it falls under, the test that it fell under, the user privileges. And like I said, by default, we run a system, but you can absolutely attribute a persona based on the username and password and start to execute that as if you were that specific individual. The asset of which we test against, and the outcomes. And now when we dive into this, again, the construct's going to look the same regardless of what scenario you're diving into. You're going to see activity details, mitigation recommendations, detection details, and indicators of compromise. So we just go one by one through here. First and foremost, activity details. This is showing us how, in fact, we came to the determination that this was not prevented. And for us, not prevented means that the Python scenario, the Python script, based upon that scenario, was not capable of executing on the endpoint itself. And that could have been because there was your security stack got in the way, which is a good thing, or it could have been because there was some sort of GPO or user privileges that got in the way as well. Whatever the case may be, if you get a prevention, right, that means that the Python scenario, the Python script, again, was not capable of running. However, if you get a not prevented, right, hopefully you'll get a detected based on integrations, but not prevented obviously means that the Python script is capable of running, and this is showing the outcome of that, right? So we see that we successfully executed the script file deletion underscore or file underscore deletion.bat right here. And the cool thing is too, when we talk about do no harm, and going back to the architecture itself, when we start to run through these scenarios and we execute them, and I talk to the 2-minute TTL, right? We are running these on the endpoint, either anatomically or atomically, and we have the ability to either leave telemetry on the endpoint or clean up and remove telemetry. So a lot of threat hunters that we work with, they want to use this for training purposes. They want to leave the telemetry or the IOCs that are indicative of nefarious behavior on that endpoint so they can start to train against that in the event of real world situations, right? But we absolutely do a cleanup script by default. In fact, when we're doing something along the lines of like credential harvesting, and knowing that this is a platform that pulls back a lot of data that could be utilized in harmful ways, one of the things that if some sort of nefarious actor did get access to this platform, the one thing that they cannot do is when we do something along the lines of like a Mimikatz credential harvesting exercise, we are not pulling credentials back to the platform itself. In fact, we redact the credentials. We will only showcase the first 3 characters and we will redact the rest. And that is happening at the endpoint layer itself. None of that data is being passed up to the platform. And both at the platform and the endpoint level, we are doing encryption at rest for compliance purposes as well. So know that when we are communicating TLS encrypted, that even when the data is sitting at rest, it is in fact encrypted as well. Mitigation recommendations, pass or fail. Some of these will be very generic in nature, right? In this case, this is very generic. It says install or verify advanced endpoint security technology. Subjective, right? It's dependent on the scenario itself. We have some that are very prescriptive, but we will always point to a body of knowledge too if we're recommending that you should take some sort of action, right? In this case, install or verify advanced endpoint security technologies. We are agnostic, so we're not going to tell you to go out and get CrowdStrike or Carbon Black or Trend Micro or any of the others. We definitely integrate with them, and we want you to understand the level of efficacy associated across the board from a MITRE ATT&CK standpoint, but you won't see us recommend any specific technologies. As far as detection details are concerned, you can see that we have a couple in here, one of which is that of Microsoft. And this is showcasing the ability to do direct to native API integrations. So now we see that when we ran this, we did have some sort of detection logic here. And now to understand this even further outside of just AttackIQ, we can now dive into the Microsoft Defender dashboard, right? So I'm not going to log in here, but if I were to do so, we would be able to look at all the telemetry, the observables, the attack tree that was associated. And now we can look at it as if this is a real world incident within our Microsoft Defender ATP environment, or insert CrowdStrike, Carbon Black, etc. On top of that, we also have the ability to generate IOCs, right? So when we talk about threat intel gathering or hunting or development, we provide you with the exact line of code that was being ran. We provide you with the exact line of PowerShell, WMI, Nmap switches, you name it, right? This is all available to you, available to be exported out of the platform as well, right? And again, you can use this for threat hunting purposes. You can take this data, you can generate your own threat intelligence by way of the AttackIQ platform, take this data and integrate it back up into your threat intel provider platform, your TIPS platform. Also, we showcase the openness of the platform. We talked about being able to customize the scenarios, pull down the scenario Python code themselves, but also being able to look at the logs, right? So some of the things that we're doing, we're not necessarily showcasing within the UI. Again, this goes back to not inundating the analysts themselves, but we still have the ability to showcase, if you so choose, the logs that are associated here, or depending on whether or not you're looking at the main log or the AttackIQ server log itself, right? So you have the ability to download logs for troubleshooting purposes or just for further reconnaissance to really understand what it is that's being executed behind the scenes. And then again, having the ability to produce some sort of outcomes here from a reporting standpoint. But before we do that, I want to showcase the ability to map this over to MITRE ATT&CK. Right, so understanding that us as defenders, we're operating, or C-levels or stakeholders, what have you, we're operating from a right to left. Our job is to reduce risk across the organization. And in order to do so, we need to understand where the adversaries are able to really do the most amount of damage to us. Right, so by way of running this test, we can showcase this in a heat map fashion, showcasing prevention, detection, or if we want to look at it from a combined outcome aspect, and we can start to expand or collapse these sub-techniques. So like I said, we're operating from a right to left. The more that we can minimize risk and impact across the board, from impact to exfil, command and control collection, all the way on to, initial access, we're doing pretty good, right? Understanding we'll never get to 100%, but that's the name of the game, is reducing risk. Now, your adversaries, your red teamers, pen testers alike, are operating from a left to right perspective, right? So they have to go through their playbook in order to get to ultimately satisfy the goal, right? And that goal may be to move laterally to another machine and then start, from execution persistence privilege-esque on, or it may be to exfil directly from the endpoint of which they maintained a foothold on, right? Regardless, like I said, now we have a way of building out threat-informed defense, playing this out in a manner that is threat-based, not just risk mappings. And now we can start to take this empirical data, map it to that of a MITRE ATT&CK heat map. We can take a screenshot. We can provide this to senior level executives, boardroom, et cetera, to showcase, yes, we are reducing the attack surface and we are minimizing risk because we have taken the threat-informed defensive approach and we are utilizing adversarial known TTPs to execute against this. Furthermore, we can generate reports, right? So what good would it be to be able to run assessments if you can't generate something tangible outside of that, right? So we have a couple different reports that I spoke to already. We have a detailed report or a summary report. And I'll just dive into one of these. You can add a couple different ones as well, but we can edit, we can email, download, delete it, but I just want to view this, right? And by doing so, we can do a couple different things. You can provide your own cover page. In this case, I have not. And you can also provide your own branding here as well. And what you'll see, construct remains the same. You'll see the title page, you'll see the assessment name, the reports, what the date timestamp, who the report was generated by, but more so, again, once you get into the meat and potatoes behind this, we're showing you the overall status, how many unique scenarios, how many were prevented versus that of detected, and then we break it down by individual tests, right? And this is just meant to be a summary. Obviously, we can get a lot more granular if we start to look at the detailed report. But nonetheless, this is a 1-2 pager that you can deliver or you can utilize for situational awareness purposes to really understand, okay, we played out the NIST 853 revision 4 control overview assessment template within AttackIQ. What's the outcomes now look like within our environment, and where do we need to start going and implementing some sort of mitigation before we go and retest this, right? Again, this is automated, right? So we don't need to expend human capital to repeat these same levels of tests. Where we do need to utilize human capital is on the other end, right? Is the mitigation, or taking that and realigning it. We get into a lot of conversations with the red teams, right? And understandably, they do a lot of great things. This is by no means meant to be a cobalt strike. It's not meant to be a hacker tool set. This is a risk management platform, albeit you do have the ability and the opportunity as a red teamer to still utilize this to do some rudimentary style attacks, right? That you don't necessarily want to script against and whatnot. So you can use this. We have 26 different use cases outside of just compliance that we've been speaking to. In fact, we can use this for CI/CD purposes, red, blue team augmentation. Purple team is obviously the hotness these days. So we can do this for purple team engagements. But again, the whole name of this is to be able to, the whole name of the game is to be able to attribute risk in a way that is threat informed by playing out these adversarial TTPs. And finally, outside of being able to produce reports, notifications. So being able to automate this from a notification standpoint. So in this case, we saw that we had a 4% pass on this last run. So now we can set a threshold. Now we said, okay, based on this environment, our baseline is 4%. So if we go below 4%, and let's just use our imagination, let's say this is 80%, right? If we fall below that, based on a defined threshold that we want to set here, similar to like how I set this up with regards to the scheduling, right? So if I did jason@attackiq.com, send test email, now I can save this, save myself as a recipient, and now I can go in and set the threshold. So now I will get notified by way of email to let me know whether this is being ran hourly, daily, weekly, monthly, or even yearly. I'm gonna get an email. I don't have to live within the platform, and now it's gonna tell me, hey, Jason, we ran this NIST 853 revision 4 overview assessment, and the results were now 78%. So now send me an email letting me know that, right? That it fell below or went above the 4% threshold. And likewise, you can do that for ServiceNow. We can create incident tickets. Slack, we have Slack access, AWS, as well as creating Jira flows here as well. And one last thing to speak to as well, we do allow, obviously we spoke to extensive RBAC controls and getting access to the platform, single sign-on and whatnot, username, password, but you also have the ability to restrict specific assessments, right? So not only can we restrict what you can and can't do within the platform from a global holistic standpoint, we can also restrict what you can do per assessment. So in this case, if I'm doing something like compliance and there's no reason for anyone else on my team to be able to see the outcomes for whatever reason, I can simply go in and I can add a team member here. And by doing so, now I can set that project role here, right? So now Ben Opal is only a guest, and the guest is only capable of viewing the assessment, the reports, and the assessment users and groups. By doing so, adding one other person to this will then thereby eliminate the ability for anyone else who's not part of this user group or does not have access to this specific assessment from being able to see the outcomes here. And finally, just looking at this from a dashboard overview standpoint, and like I said, we have 26 use cases. We do this weekly demo on the weekly, every Thursday, same time. We attacked many different use cases. I think last week we spoke to attack graphs in our anatomic engine. So there's a lot more to this. If you would like to reach out to me with any further questions, now that we've come up on our 45 minutes together, please do, jason@attackiq.com. I'll be happy to help. Like I said, I support the public sector here at AttackIQ, but I've been here for 2 years. We're a startup, so I know where all the bodies are buried and who I need to reach out to in the event that you need support. Again, thank you for your time today. I hope you learned something new, and I look forward to hopefully doing business with you in the future.